Welcome to our podcast on extreme sport, media, and athlete mental health. I'm Melissa. Today we have Amanda, Leo, Lillian, and our guest, Bree. Our goal for this episode is to explore free solo climbing, one of the most extreme forms of rock climbing, and discuss how public perception, social norms, and media framing influence not only who is celebrated or criticized, but also the psychological well being of athletes and participants. We'll bring both academic research and real world examples to connect theory with practice.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Today we'll also discuss the broader implications for inclusion, identity, and leadership in high-risk sport contexts. While free solo climbing may seem like a niche extreme sport, Trendafilova and Ziakas identify that the dynamics we observe, such as how legitimacy is judged or how social norms shape behavior, are present in many sport and outdoor activity contexts, from climbing clubs to expedition leadership.
We'll also talk about social cultural dimensions, such as how norms, subcultural expectations, and media narratives influence what gets rewarded or punished.
I'll also integrate trainers' 8 psychological well-being domains to show how community reactions and media pressures impact athletes' mental well-being. And we'll also introduce a few suggestions to the sports sector that can definitely help support these athletes.
Joining us is Bree. She's a trip leader and EDI coordinator of the Varsity Outdoors Club, which is the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Coordinator at UBC.
I'll bring in a practical perspective from outdoor leadership and climbing trip management. As a trip of Varsity Outdoors Club and experienced trip leader, I've observed how perceived competence, risk tolerance, and social norms affect decision-making and inclusion in real-world climbing scenarios.
So to start off, Mel, what exactly is free soloing?
Well, free soloing is climbing with no ropes, harness, or any protective gear at all. Falls are usually fatal. Most climbers use extensive safety systems when climbing, so extreme sports like this are actually gaining a lot of more media attention and participation in recent years.
From a psychological and sociological perspective, it's important to note that free soloing is both a physical and cultural act. Certain behaviors are praised while others are criticized. Cultural factors like status, bias, and professional production of free soloing media shape audience perception, as Lynn and colleagues discuss in their 2016 article.
So, if culture has such a strong role, what exactly does the climbing culture entail?
Well, climbing culture, they value stoicism, seriousness, and humility. Posner's master's thesis from 2020, she relates how deviations from such norms, like humor or social media focused content, may be perceived as less legitimate and could face criticism. Extreme athletes and free solo climbers are often framed in a hegemonic masculine way in the media and popular culture.
Wait, Leah, what exactly is hegemonic masculinity?
Well, it's a socially constructed concept promoting male dominance and societal ideas of male behavior, which emphasizes emotional control, rationality, and toughness, which is defined by Connell in his 1995 paper. This creates a symbolic narrative within climbing of fearlessness and control. Horton and colleagues in 2025, they define the negative impacts of hegemonic masculinity as toxic masculinity. But this is socially constructed. Legitimacy isn't just based off the objective level of physical risk.
And from a well being standpoint, even though free soloists may appear fearless, the psychological demands are immense. Climbers may experience anxiety, stress, and pressures that are often invisible to the public. Research in extreme sports psychology shows that fear is rarely absent. Athletes manage it, they integrate it, and as Kalinowska and colleagues pointed out, they even find meaning and purpose through it. Bree, can you tell us a little bit about your experiences?
In my experience leading climbing trips, I've noticed the same thing. The participants who seem calm and fearless are often the ones most trusted to lead or take on riskier routes. That trust is influenced not only by skill, but by social perception, appearance of confidence, composure, just like the Stoic gender norms that Leo mentioned.
What you have mentioned actually aligns with the literature on status bias and elite representation. Zha et al. In 2018 show that we are highly persuaded by those whom we perceive as high status. For example, in the documentary Free Solo, which follows Alex Honnold as he scales a 3,000-foot rock without any safety gear, it is a professionally filmed documentary with high-quality footage, editing, and intense, almost eerie-like music. The camera, editing, and narrative construction convey authority and legitimacy, shaping audience perception. Lynn and colleagues have also shown that in media, different efforts can increase credibility, such as professionalism, video quality, and more.
Can video editing and the way a video is made really make that much of a difference in perception, though?
Great question, Lillian. Well, media framing has a huge influence on how dangerous a climb appears. Professionally produced films tend to create a sense of safety and control, while casual or shaky footage feels far more dangerous. Media scholars note that high production adventure films can unintentionally sanitize risk because the audience perceives the setting as managed, as mentioned by O and colleagues. Meanwhile, Thorpe exemplifies how unedited GoPro or phone footage heightens the emotional response and can make the same climb seem more hazardous. The real risk doesn't change, but the framing does.
Well, on the other hand, Instagram influencer named Lincoln Knowles, who posts footage of himself free soloing while just playing rap music and making jokes. And there's even a clip of him immediately failing the initial start of a climb. This makes his climbs seem way less controlled and more casual, which violates hegemonic masculinity norms and creates a perception of recklessness and therefore a lack of trust.
But why does this matter? Why does the difference in presentation actually impact legitimacy?
Well, cultural assumptions are embedded when perceiving these athletes. We know the climbing community values stoicism and seriousness, but deviating from these norms by posting playful and humorous climbing videos, such the ones that Lincoln posts, can provoke ridicule, even if the act itself is equally skillful or as risky as Alex's, which was emphasized in Posner's 2020 paper.
Now, these perceptions have real implications for psychological well being. Athletes judged as legitimate experience different pressures than those who are publicly ridiculed. Naslund and colleagues in 2020 conducted a review on how social media interactions can impact mental well being. Now, they found that negative interactions like cyberbullying, which involves hostile comments, isolation, and other negative interactions online, can increase the risk of anxiety and depression like symptoms. Even if Lincoln himself says he doesn't care, research says that public scrutiny can affect his emotional well being.
Research also shows that online platforms amplify social evaluation. Negative comments, ridicule, or threats, even if anonymous, can have measurable impacts on stress, anxiety, and self perception, as mentioned in a review by Shannon and her colleagues. Now, Lillian, I'm wondering if there are any specific routes through which social media can impact mental health. Or, in other words, are there mediators?
So, there actually are many mechanisms that can help to explain this relationship between social media use and poor mental health. A review by Keels and colleagues in 2020 noted that decreased perceived social support was a major factor that could explain this correlation. Now, I wanted to highlight this one specifically because it ties in with trainers' component of psychologically safe relationships, which is all about having a supportive community. Bree, do you think that these legitimacy biases can also have other negative impacts?
Well, from a leadership perspective, perceived legitimacy affects the group dynamics, especially the social hierarchy and who is considered a leader and who isn't. I can see that sometimes in the groups I lead, the males who present themselves as almost fearless tend to become the so-called leaders of the group, and others follow their behaviors and suggestions. But it is interesting that most of the time, it is the males who act in this stoic manner.
This is a great example of how the toxic masculine norms can reveal itself in a real world situation. I also can relate to this as a woman of color working in the outdoor and high risk environments, including guiding on Mount Fuji and working as a backcountry horseback guide in Banff. Even though I often climb more technical and difficult routes than many of my male peers, and have a more advanced level of wilderness first aid, I'm still taken less seriously than my predominantly white male colleagues. I am both hyper visible when we introduce ourselves in a line and simultaneously dismissed when actually on the trail. Coming back to our media examples, this masculine norm shows up in Free Solo, the documentary following Alex Honnold when he climbed El Cap Free Solo in 2017. Alex seems very calm, controlled, and almost superhuman by his lack of emotion towards this impressive yet dangerous feat.
So what you're telling me is he actually enjoys climbing at these heights without any safety gear?
Well, sort of. Neurological studies on Alex Honnold show that his amygdala, which normally triggers fear responses, barely activates even when he's shown highly emotional or threatening images. This suggests he has an unusually high threshold for fear recognition, which may help explain how he stays calm during free solo climbs. But the key point is that Honnold is a neurological outlier. Most climbers do not share this biological profile, so his responses shouldn't be seen as typical for extreme sport athletes, as reiterated by Liu, Lin, and Wang.
So socially, Alex embodies these cultural ideas of fearlessness, stoicism, and self-discipline.
Exactly. There are also strong authenticity norms in climbing culture. Authenticity norms are social expectations and acceptances about what genuine self expression is, as defined by Lewis in 2004. Climbers are expected to be humble, serious, and grounded, meaning self promotion is often discouraged. Studies on climbing culture show that behaving too commercial or drawing attention to your own risk can be criticized because the community values authenticity and modesty, which are highlighted by Lewis again. This is also in line with toxic masculinity, where men are supposed to conceal emotions. Even though it is the norm, how can emotion suppression be harmful?
So while Honnold's public persona is very much admired, emulating it can be psychologically harmful. Kalinowska and colleagues in 2025 reveal that extreme sport can sometimes lead to heightened emotional suppression and burnout, acting negatively on well being.
In real outdoor leadership, I see this pattern all the time. In climbing groups or guiding situations, people who project that fearless stoic energy are often trusted immediately, sometimes more than those with stronger technical skills. That affects group dynamics and can push people to downplay fear and take on roles they aren't ready for, or feel like they need to match the vibe just to be taken seriously. Some people look to climbing as an outlet, but these climbing culture values have caused them to suppress their natural emotions. But one thing I'm curious about is why Alex is so celebrated, while Lincoln is ridiculed for doing the same act of free soloing.
That's a great question. The key concept that we have previously mentioned is legitimacy. It's not just what you do, but how you present yourself, how the community perceives you, and how the media frames your actions.
One possible underlying explanation for this difference in legitimacy perception is the perception of risk. So, the views on risk are not purely objective and based on the physical danger you are in. It actually is influenced by many different factors. So, one meta analysis by Wake and colleagues in 2020, looking at the influence of fear on risk taking, showed that fear is highly associated with risk. And the perception of risk will actually increase when the emotion of fear is increased, meaning when fear or emotion is expressed, people will associate more risk with that certain behavior. So when we see Alex Honnold not expressing fear through his stoic manner, we associate his behavior with actually less fear and therefore less risk. This may be why his actions seem more legitimate, since we trust that he is in control of his actions. But what are the other factors?
First, we tend to trust elite climbers because of their status, so their decisions look calculated and controlled, which makes audiences underestimate the risk. That's the skill and status bias at work. Research by Breimer and Oates highlight how extreme sport and high status athletes are often assumed to be more competent even when the risk level is objectively unchanged. Community gatekeeping also adds another layer by deciding who is allowed to take big risks. Gatekeeping is the idea that certain behaviors, memberships, are reserved for specific people and others are rejected. These rules are often unspoken, and again, they are socially determined, as Holland Smith states. Research by Monin et al. In 2017 on adventure sport communities notes that legitimacy is often granted only to those with perceived skill and social capital, which also influences whether a risky act is viewed as courageous or reckless. So risk becomes something that is managed collectively, not individually. All of this affects who gets labeled competent and who gets labeled as reckless and more risky. I know gatekeeping is a new concept, so Leo, can you explain the implications of gatekeeping?
Absolutely. Community gatekeeping enforces belonging through judgment. So those who don't match the idealized image of a climber may be marginalized, criticized, or dismissed, as shown in Cunningham et al.'s 2018 review. Humor, self-promotion, or casually posting can signal lack of respect or recklessness, even if the behavior itself is technically competent. It also increases pressure and psychological strain for anyone not fitting the ideal climber mold. From Johnson and all, their paper, social norms dictate who is allowed to take extreme risks, who is seen as legitimate, and who is marginalized for similar behaviors.
And the psychological impact of this is profound. The desire to fit in or be let into this gate-kept free solo community can actually cause fear of ridicule and pressures to suppress emotion. which we know are two factors that negatively impact mental well-being. Bree, what do you think is one way that we could possibly combat this?
So, as trip leaders, recognizing these social biases is essential. Misperceptions about who is competent based on perceived legitimacy can affect risk allocation, supervision, and overall group safety. So, this is why we have trip leader training in certain clubs to combat these norms by teaching leaders how to foster safe environments for new climbers. As the equality, diversity, and inclusion representative, ungatekeeping climbing is very important to me.
The striking fact that both Alex and Lincoln performed technically similar feat, climbing without ropes, yet public reaction differs dramatically, raises questions about social assumptions, status, and presentation.
Yeah, so when we look at free soloing, it's easy to focus only on the physical danger. But the research by Langseth and Salveson shows that a lot of the risk taking in this sport is shaped by culture and how we perceive the climbers who do it.
Just because someone can climb really hard routes, it doesn't automatically mean they're safer or more skilled overall. Sometimes it just means they're physically stronger or train harder. For example, Adam Ondra can climb some of the hardest routes in the world, but his belaying, how he manages the rope to protect his climber, sometimes doesn't follow safe basics that beginners are taught. In guiding or coaching, leaders often rely on perceived legitimacy to decide who should lead and take on riskier tasks. This can create unfair inequalities and put unnecessary psychological pressure on people who are just as capable but don't fit the expected image of a leader.
So, now that we have gone over the social norms influencing perceptions as well as some factors affecting legitimacy, let's connect these examples to a few of trainers' 8 domains of psychological well being, which offer a structured way to understand the impact on climbers. So, for Alex, his extreme stoicism and supported public image can possibly foster his self confidence and fulfill a sense of self purpose within the climbing community. His autonomous choices are also endorsed by sponsorships, which facilitate a sense of positive personal agency. And the community encouragement contributes to safe relationships as well as psychological adaptability, since social support is a very useful resource to deal with stressors.
Wow, it seems that Alex has a great deal of support from the public, which can help boost his psychological well being. But what about Lincoln?
That's another story. So, Lincoln actually doesn't have any sponsorships, and the ridicule and online criticism threaten his well being in many, many ways. So, when climbers internalize these social expectations, like maintaining a stoic demeanor and suppressing these fear emotions to match those masculinity norms, trainers' component of autonomy can be undermined. So, in Lincoln's case, the internalization of masculine norms can lead him to restrict his choices and self expression online, ultimately decreasing his autonomy. Lincoln's self worth and confidence can also be depleted, as negative online feedback can significantly impact self esteem, as noted by Patchen in 2020. The lack of support that Knowles faces can also deplete his social support in safe relationships, ultimately impacting his ability to psychologically adapt. According to Hornby and colleagues in 2024, some who engage in extreme sports are actually chasing a sense of belonging, again, suggesting how detrimental these harsh comments can be to the appraisal of safe relationships.
Wow, so both of these cases illustrate that public perception and social norms affect well being as much as or more than the physical risk themselves. These are two extreme cases of free soloists, so how does this come up in more recreational aspects, Bree?
This is directly relevant for recreational outdoor sports contexts. Trip leaders and coaches need to understand that perceived legitimacy isn't just a superficial social factor, it shapes well being. You mentioned this reaction is coming from within online platforms, but I also see this in real life experiences. Although not with explicit words and criticism, climbers' attitudes and therefore treatment onward can drastically change depending on whether they fit the climbing culture norms. What I am wondering is, what suggestions do you guys have to address this issue?
Yes, let's describe some practical implications. For sports psychologists, mental consultants, or anyone who supports or works with climbers and athletes in general, one key takeaway is that an athlete's well being is shaped as much by social perception and community norms as it is by physical risks. The literature supports this. Culturally competent sports psychology practice must account for social and structural factors like gatekeeping, status hierarchies, and media influence, like we discussed earlier, rather than focusing solely on individual skill or fear management. This can also help foster intrinsic self-worth, as athletes can learn skills to buffer the negative impacts of social media, which is an important facet identified by trainer. Coaches and sport leaders should also be educated on legitimacy biases. Athletes who appear more stoic, confident, or traditionally masculine, as described by Connell, are often perceived as more competent, which can distort risk management and support allocation. This is especially important, as Horton noted, that those who embody this toxic masculine persona are actually less likely to seek psychological help. Proper education to fight these norms can increase positive support systems by reducing community gatekeeping behaviors. As Simon, Homan, and Siner state, all participants perform best in their study in the absence of social tensions and when the atmosphere between the climbing partners were positive.
So, Trainer's 8 domains of psychological well being actually provide a nice framework for professionals supporting athletes. So, we wanted to highlight a few here. First, being autonomy, so encouraging athletes to make informed decisions rather than just performing to impress others. And second, self worth, as we mentioned, providing coping strategies to social media specific stressors and criticism can help protect these athletes' self worth. And third, personal balance. Something interesting is that Alex Honnold noted that most of the people that he knows who have stopped free soloing have either tragically passed away or started a family. So, encouraging these athletes to discover and engage in domains of their lives can help to avoid exhaustion and burnout by finding a balance. And lastly, safe relationships. This one is more directed at the general public. Education on the negative impact of cyberbullying, as well as these masculine stereotypes, can actually help to combat this negative online feedback to those who do not fit these societal norms. This can help to buffer against the harmful effects of perceived social support.
From a practical leadership standpoint, this translates into intentionally building inclusive and psychologically safe environments. TRIP leaders and coaches can structure decision-making to reduce social bias, ensure fair distribution of risk, and validate emotional expression without stigma.
In recreational climbing and outdoor programs, perceived legitimacy can influence a group's trust. Someone who appears risk tolerant and confident may be trusted more, regardless of their actual skills and abilities. This mirrors what we saw with Honnold and Knowles. TRIP leaders should consciously evaluate competence versus perception. Risk perception and risk assessments are an important component of leadership in all outdoor sports. Gatekeeping also manifests in VOC contexts. The Varsity Outdoors Club, students or participants who deviate from these dominant norms, humor, emotional expression, non-masculine behaviors, may be socially marginalized. Leaders must actively counteract these tendencies to foster inclusivity and mental well-being.
Climbing programs should also include debriefing sessions to normalize the discussion of fear, doubt, and stress. We know that emotional expression is important for stress release, and creating a safe space that encourages expression can also aid in psychological adaptation. These sessions should explicitly define expectations for risk management to reduce reliance on perceived legitimacy, and should be led by someone who has experience in the field, like an experienced climber. This is in line with a feminist ethics of care perspective and a client-centered approach. This includes having specialized support for climbers, especially free soloists. As each sport has its own unique stressors, having knowledgeable professionals or experienced mentors can further aid in supporting the complex experiences of those who free solo.
Now let's take a step back. What do Honnold and Knowles teach us about extreme sport culture? First, that risk perception is socially constructed. The same action can be heroic or reckless depending on status, media protection, and adherence to cultural norms. Second, mental health in extreme sports is also tied to social feedback, not just subjective dangers. Emotional suppression, fear of ridicule, and community gatekeeping are critical sensors. Third, social norms and legitimacy bias influence leadership and behavior choices. This isn't limited to just the elite athletes. It occurs in climbing clubs, outdoor programs, both in university and in adulthood. Recognizing these dynamics help TRIP leaders, coaches, and sport professionals design safer and more inclusive environments. Understanding that perceived legitimacy and community bias shape behavior is key to risk management and well-being.
And that's it. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast today.
Yeah, we hope you learned a thing or two about free soloing and how culture and psychology are intertwined within the physical sport.
Thank you so much to our guest Bree for joining us this time, and tune in next episode to hear from a very special guest, Alex Honnold himself.
Whoa, but for now, keep your hands chalked and those negative social media comments blocked.